This month, we have decided to do something special. It's always wonderful to hear stories coming from people's lives, and today is especially poignant because David Doster is here to share the story of his father's life, Grover Doster, who was a member of our church and died a few years ago, but was a wonderful part of what's going on, and he speaks well of this day of freedom. So without taking any more of David's time, I'll introduce David Doster.
Thank you. Pastor Tom asked me to talk about one of my favorite subjects today. Grover and Eloise Doster, my parents, they were members here for over 20 years. He thought they would be an appropriate topic for the 4th of July as their history is in alignment with much of our nation's history. My father passed away 9 days after their 72nd anniversary. As he would say, 72 years to the same woman. And of course, my mother's response would be, yeah, to the same man. Childhood sweethearts since grade school. When my mother's family moved from Gainesville to Monroe, Georgia, both born in 1922, they experienced the Depression, a fact that shaped their lives. Along the way, there were bumps in the road, like when they were in high school, and my mother suggested that they go to the movies. My dad said he didn't feel well and was going to stay home. Well, my mom wasn't going to stay home, so she went with some of her friends, and in the dark theater, she heard my father's distinctive laughter. You can rest assured he paid dearly for that mistake. Well, upon graduating from high school in 1939, my father attended school at North Georgia Military College, a 2-year program in Dahlonega, Georgia, while my mother attended commercial or vocational school for secretarial training and then worked for the WPA, Works Progress Administration. Dad entered into marine aviation in early 1942, and then in January of 1943, my parents were married at her parents' home in Monroe, Georgia. And as my father only had a very brief liberty, they took a few photos and got on the road for Jacksonville, Florida, where he was completing his training to be a Corsair pilot. Their honeymoon was not the stuff of dreams. They had to hurry south to Jacksonville as my father had Cinderella liberty, requiring him to check in by midnight. Fortunately, the duty officer took pity on him and said, go spend some time with your bride before reporting for muster at 6 a.m. The motel they had found was barely a 1-star by today's standards, but their dinner was even worse. Chicken salad sandwiches with old milk that made them both sick to their stomachs. Not a very auspicious beginning for their marriage. Well, in late 1943, my father's squadron received word that they would be shipping out of San Diego. And so the squadron, based in Cherry Point, North Carolina, had to fly cross-country and stage for departure. On the first leg of the journey en route to Atlanta, one of the aircraft crashed, killing the pilot. Family and friends, including my mother, who were waiting at the airfield, learned of the crash but didn't know the name of the pilot until they had all landed. My mother and 2 other wives decided that they were going to drive to San Diego in hopes of seeing their husbands before they shipped out. Friends and family made sure that the wives had enough ration cards for fuel to get them to and from California. They did get to spend a couple of weeks together before embarkation. The wives had gotten to San Diego before the squadron, as there had been some bad storms crossing the country, and in the process they had lost 4 more planes and 2 more pilots. The wives' trip had not been totally uneventful. On their first day out from Georgia, they had a flat tire in a small Alabama town. So they got a room and hoped to get the tire fixed the following morning. Well, this was a weekend, and though the gas station had a replacement tire, they weren't able to sell it to the ladies without approval of the ration board. That morning, sitting at a diner, their waitress overheard them and said, "Ladies, we'll get you on the road today. I'll just call the ration board rep and tell him to come in and approve it." He did, and they were on their way again in a couple of hours. Their time in San Diego was the honeymoon they had missed out on months before. But of course, all good things must come to an end, and my father shipped out. Now the wives had to make the return trip to the East Coast. It was uneventful. War in the Pacific was pretty horrific, but until I was a Marine myself, Dad didn't share the less savory tales. He did, however, share with me a crazy moment that occurred within the first hours after his arrival at Vella La Vella Airfield in the Solomon Islands. You may remember the TV show The Black Sheep Squadron, starring Robert Conrad as Major Greg Pappy Boyington, a legendary Marine flying ace. Well, my father naturally had heard of Major Boyington, but didn't know what he looked like. Dad had been invited over to a tent belonging to the Black Sheep Squadron by a pilot my dad had known in training. And while they were sitting on cots opposite one another catching up, a man walked in wearing nothing but his flight boots and sat down on the cot next to my dad, put his arm around his shoulder and said, "Hey, how you doing?" My father, not realizing who the streaker might be, was balling up his fist to deliver his own greeting. My dad's friend, seeing the potential disaster unfolding, hastily introduced my father to Pappy Boyington. Of course, my father opened his hand and offered it in a handshake. 2 weeks later, Pappy Boyington was shot down by enemy fire, and he served out the rest of the war in a Japanese prison camp. In June of 1944, my sister was born. By the time the news caught up to my father, he was flying missions out of Guam. 7 months later, my father was able to return to the States, where he was reunited with my mother and met his daughter Norma for the first time. After the war, my father decided to go back to his hometown to open a gas station. But there were already plenty of those. So maybe the town's first liquor store. But Walton County was dry by law. I'm sure he could have figured that out. So he went to the Marine recruiter and asked to rejoin the Corps. And he was told that there were far too many with the same intention. And so he couldn't resume duties in the same rank, captain. Even though he was a decorated aviator, he would be enlisting as a private first class. So he did, and was then promoted to master sergeant several months later, becoming a flying master sergeant, or as they call themselves, flying peons. As an enlisted pilot, Dad trained to fly photo reconnaissance, which he would later do in combat in Korea. In September 1948, they welcomed my brother into the world. He was from the first day a precocious, athletic force of nature who followed in my father's footsteps and became a Marine aviator himself until his tragic death as a Harrier pilot on July 3rd, 1975. In the Korean War, my father, an officer once again, flew both prop planes like his favorite, the Corsair, and some of the first jets in the Marine Corps' fleet, the Banshee, as a reconnaissance jet. In a different squadron, but at the same airfield, were a couple of other Marine pilots. You may recognize their names, John Glenn and Ted Williams. After the Korean War, Dad served as a flight instructor and research and development expert for Marine aviation. And still in photo reconnaissance, he was assigned to Miami, Florida, where the baby of the family was born in June of 1953, me. During all this, my mother was not only raising 3 kids, but finding time to volunteer. She was a Red Cross Gray Lady, helping the doctors and nurses whenever she could. Her volunteer efforts continued throughout the course of my father's career as a Marine, culminating in receiving a 30-year service pin. Dad wasn't the only one with leadership and energy. Dad then underwent training to become a helicopter pilot, and in 1958, while assigned to the Marine Airfield in Atsugi, Japan, Dad rescued by helicopter a young hiker who was in trouble on the slopes of Mount Fuji. Meanwhile, my mom is raising the 3 of us back in Monroe, Georgia, 1 in high school, 1 in grade school, and 1 in kindergarten. The colds and flu and school had her hands full. In 1959, Dad was assigned to HMX-1 Squadron at Quantico, Virginia, the home of the Marine helicopters that fly the President. As the squadron operations officer, he found himself not only flying Presidents Eisenhower and then Kennedy, but also doing the logistical planning for presidential trips like President Eisenhower's tour of South America, where my dad was tasked with getting the helicopters through the Andes Mountains, theoretically above the aircraft's capability. At the end of his tour of duty with the squadron, Dad was chosen to be the assistant naval aide to President Kennedy. It was a magical time, and I was old enough to understand its significance. Our home was just outside the Beltway in Springfield, Virginia. We had 2 additional phones in the house, one in the garage, where Dad may be tinkering on his time off from work, and one next to my dad's side of the bed. Both were directly linked to the switchboard at the White House. There were some cool privileges for family members of the staff, like the Christmas party and the Easter egg hunt on the lawn at the White House. My dad used to enjoy relating a time when he was walking down the hallway of one of the basement floors and ran into President Kennedy, who was on his way to the barbershop. Of course, my dad tried to get out of his way, but the president stopped him and said, "Hey, Major, I was on my way to get a haircut, but I don't have any money. Can I borrow $10? If you go see Pierre Salinger, the press secretary, he'll pay you back." Well, sure enough, when Dad went to see Pierre, all he had to say was, "Excuse me, I just ran into the president going for a haircut." And Pierre reached for his wallet and said, "Okay, how much did he borrow?" Mom was now shepherding a college co-ed, a teen, and an adolescent. She may have been just as heavily tasked as my dad. After leaving the White House in 1964, Dad attended a 10-month-long school for officers of his rank. And then we were transferred to Naples, Italy, where he served in the intelligence section of Allied Forces Southern Europe, a part of NATO. We were fortunate enough to do some traveling in Europe, and I was definitely enriched by the experience of living overseas as I was in my early teens. Well, now it was 1967. On the other side of the world, the Vietnam War was heating up. Dad had to undergo some additional helicopter training to fly the newer and larger CH-53 Sea Stallion. He arrived in Vietnam in early 1968, just in time for the Tet Offensive, considered to be some of the most intense fighting of the war. Back home in Monroe, Georgia, where our family always went when Dad was overseas, my mother and I lived with my grandmother in her home. My sister was married, and my brother was attending Georgia Tech in Atlanta. I was in high school and definitely aware of what was going on, watching the network news every night, seeing the wounded get flown away from the battle in helicopters, and wondering what role my father was playing in this very intense drama. My most vivid memories of that time were trying to fall asleep in a house with no AC, very thin walls, and listening to nightly pounding of the manual typewriter keys on a wooden desk sitting on a wooden floor. But the sound was somehow reassuring as my mother and father exchanged letters every day. There were 2 more assignments in the remaining 5 years of my father's 32 hitch with the Marine Corps, one at the Marine headquarters then in Arlington, Virginia, and his last as commanding officer of the largest helicopter base in the free world, New River Air Station in North Carolina. When Dad retired in 1974, he and Mom moved off base and into their 51st home. Some had been apartments, some had been third-floor cold water walk-ups, some half of a Quonset hut, but always filled with love. They ended up having 40 more years together, always kissing each other if one was leaving the house to go somewhere. That's true love. My father is buried in Arlington with my brother, and my mother will join them. Appropriately, the grave is located between the Marine Memorial and President Kennedy's final resting place. Thank you.
freedom is not free. And this story of a life well lived, as we heard in the scripture, I fought the good fight. I have finished the race. 3 wars and paying for our freedom. And I'm not one to mix politics or government with church much. But this is a story of freedom. And not just Grover, but Eloise as well. It's not always how we claim our faith to the world. In the true sense, it's how we live our faith that impacts the world. Our lives, more than our words, are our witness. Grover and Eloise Doster joined the church a quarter century ago in 1996. They were some of the first people I got to know here in Port Orange. You see, Grover and I had the pleasure of having a colonoscopy on the same day. That was my first year here at First Church. When he saw me, I wanted to make sure he knew that they hadn't called in the pastor with bad news. So we had a good laugh about that. When I think of the two of them, I would say that Colossians 3:12 speaks of them as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. Clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Sadly, I never knew their whole story. I never really knew Grover's story until Grover's death. I went to their home, and the moment I heard, and that was on a Sunday, by the way, as I remember, and when I was leaving, I saw a picture of Grover shaking hands with Dwight Eisenhower. Now, that'll turn your head pretty quick. And as you heard, they both had an amazing life together. A hero in service and a heroine at home. The passage that I chose for Colonel Doster's memorial was from Luke 16:10. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. That was Grover in his service to us all. And we especially remember this Independence Day and Eloise and her enduring service to her family, her church family, and to her country. It seems such a loss that we never got the chance to tell her story because of the pandemic this past year. For they were faithful always. They sat right over where Debbie and David are sitting right now, and they were one of those couples that you look at them and you knew that they still loved each other in an amazing way. That aura of love that surrounds. They were truly a witness of an amazing couple can be. They were a true witness of what love can be. They witnessed to what faithful is all about. And they each could have boasted. Grover for an incredibly distinguished career, and Eloise as a loving mother of 3 kids that she had to manage most of the time by herself. But you never heard that from either of them. They were clothed with compassion for all they met. They were sweet, sweet people. And they were, and without a comment, they never shared their story. They had compassion for me as their pastor. They had kindness, humility, and patience. And so their story of love and courage almost went without comment, except that they did make a mark on their son, David, proud of his parents and proud to share their witness today. This was tough for David. We all heard that. Sharing the story of patriotism, not in a bold, outspoken way, but with humility. So we could embrace the words of Matthew 25:21. Well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in handling this small amount. So now I will give you many more responsibilities. So this 4th of July, in honor of these two patriots. Let's celebrate together. And the key word is together. Together. To Grover, Colonel Doster, well done. And Eloise Doster, well done. May we serve the world as they have. And I dare say, David, speaking for your parents, who I know would be proud, well done. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.